So yesterday, Trump announced via Truth Social a 10% tariff on BRICS nations. This is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates for, quote, anti-American policies, with a July 9th deadline for trade negotiations to avoid higher tariffs. Now, this coincided with the 17th BRICS summit, which was taking place in Rio de Janeiro, where Chinese President Xi Jinping, for the first time in 12 years, was absent, sending Premier Li Qiang instead, citing a scheduling conflict amid domestic economic challenges and a reported military purge. The summit criticized U.S. tariffs for disrupting global supply chains, condemned U.S. military strikes on Iran, and pushed de-dollarization and intra-BRICS trade, which saw an 8% increase in China-India trade in 2024. However, what is going on underneath the surface is actually exposing the vulnerabilities of BRICS while reinforcing U.S. dominance. Now, President Trump's tariff threat exploits BRICS' reliance on the U.S. market, where China's 2024 trade surplus was $279 billion. India exported $83 billion in goods and services, and Brazil sent $36 billion in agricultural products. A 10% tariff would increase export costs, reduce demand, and hit smaller economies hardest. Ethiopia's GDP is only $127 billion, and they rely on the U.S. for 10% of its textile exports, while Egypt depends on $1.2 billion in annual agricultural trade, Indonesia's $4 billion in electronics exports, and the UAE's $5 billion in energy exports also face pretty significant risks if Trump were to escalate tariffs. Supply chain disruptions would strain China's $1.5 trillion manufacturing sector and Brazil's $50 billion raw material export sector, which would amplify revenue losses and debt pressures. Brazil's debt to GDP ratio is 78%, South Africa's is 72%. So why is Trump doing this, though? Well, he's saying he's doing it to deter de-dollarization, which really isn't a thing. It's not a problem, but also to target BRICS' push for a local currency trade and digital currencies like China's digital yuan, which frankly accounts for only 0.3% of China's transactions alone. It's not even a blip on the radar for global transactions. Meanwhile, the dollar's global share is 88% of total transactions, and this includes the fact that Russia is not on the SWIFT system. This gives the US huge amounts of leverage, and smaller members like South Africa with $6 billion in US exports may prioritize market access to the United States over BRICS bloc goals, which will stall any kind of policy efforts for the BRICS body. Now, Xi's absence also undermines BRICS cohesion. China's $18.3 trillion GDP drives the bloc's anti-Western agenda, but Li Qiang's lower stature weakens efforts to advance de-dollarization or the new development bank, which lends $1.5 billion annually compared to the IMF's $150 billion. Internal divisions are becoming more and more evident within BRICS as well, with India and its $3.4 trillion GDP strengthening ties with the United States by executing $10 billion in defense deals in 2024 alone. Brazil is another one with a $2.1 trillion GDP emphasizing global South leadership over China's vision. They want to be the leader of BRICS because they have defensive treaties with the United States that grants them a modicum of power, and the United States will actually back Brazil's play within BRICS. Now, Xi's focus on domestic issues, including this CCP conclave that's going to take place and a military purge linked to speculation about Hu Jintao's allies regaining influence, fuels perceptions of instability. China's industrial output growth slowed by several percent in Q1 of 2025. Vladimir Putin's virtual attendance due to an ICC arrest warrant amid fears that Brazil would actually detain him further fractures this image of the unstoppable BRICS when compared to organizations like the G7. This actually reduces BRICS' trade appeal to external players like Turkey or Saudi Arabia. Now, the U.S. dominates BRICS economically, financially, and militarily. Its $25.5 trillion GDP nearly matches BRICS' combined GDP of $25.6 trillion, with China as the only comparable economy. The U.S. controls global finance through dollar reserve status and institutions like the IMF, where China's voting share is a whopping 6% versus the U.S. having over 16% of the voting share. U.S. military spending is huge compared to BRICS, $877 billion last year versus $450 billion in all of BRICS nations combined. This secures leverage over members like the United Arab Emirates, who buy 80% of their arms from the U.S., or Egypt, who has $1.5 billion in arms purchases from the U.S. as well. Meanwhile, Brazil is actually trained by the U.S. military. Furthermore, many of the countries in BRICS will just do whatever they want outside of the framework of BRICS, which is something that makes the organization not work properly. Examples include in 2023, India conducting trade concessions with the United States, Brazil doing a 2020 soybean deal with the United States, all while bypassing BRICS and Chinese protests. So there is a history of these countries prioritizing US deals over BRICS unity. And why wouldn't they? The US owns 25% of global trade. 1/4 of global trade is with the United States. And this forces BRICS to weigh tariff costs against its solidarity. They try to do so with intra-block trade like the $30 billion China-Russia energy deal and the New Development Bank, but it's grossly inadequate. Trying to balance democracies like India versus autocracies like China and pariah states like Russia really hinders coordination, which means that local currency trade is at a whopping 5% in BRICS, which basically shows how de-dollarization is a futile effort for BRICS and just a talking point. Now, these tariffs and BRICS internal fractures reveal a pretty stark reality here. Despite its ambitions, BRICS remains a fragmented coalition unable to challenge U.S. dominance. The U.S.'s economic might, dollar hegemony, and military superiority give it unparalleled leverage to disrupt BRICS trade, sow divisions, and stifle de-dollarization. Xi's absence and Putin's virtual attendance signal weakness, inviting skepticism from potential partners, and it undermines BRICS' global influence. And now we get to wait and see what countries will turn on each other as the July 9th deadline approaches. So we'll see which countries concede to U.S. demands and what others try to stand firm as a BRICS bloc.